for coming here today. And very, very good turnout. So thank you very much for coming to this IEEE Vehicle Technology Society Chicago chapter meeting, also joined with other particular chapters, which I will be announcing later as well. So basically, today we have Paul Wesling, who's coming to talk about the origins of Silicon Valley, how and why it happened. So just before we start, just some bit of introduction. Here we go. Okay, oops, let's see. Okay. Oops, that's not, okay, one sec. Oh, oops, oh, okay. That's not what I wanted. Apologies. Yeah, I knew that was coming, that was coming. I knew that was coming. Okay. There we go. Yeah, that's right. It's not a software thing. Okay, so our Chicago chapter, IEEE Vehicle Technology Society Chicago, is a chapter in Chicago, part of the parent organization, which is IEEE Vehicle Technology Society. So if you're familiar with IEEE, IEEE has an organization, Institute of Electronic and Electrical Engineers, and they do a lot of like technical, conferences and talks and publications and things like that. So it's a technical society. And they have different other societies, not just Vehicle Technology Society. There's like Computer Society, Magnetic Society, many different types of societies. But this one here that we are doing is Vehicle Technology Society. And we have a flagship conference called IEEE Vehicle Technology Conference, which this year in fall is happening in Honolulu. And actually last year, the Vehicle Technology Conference was actually held in Chicago. And actually VTS Chicago was a primary sponsor or so of that. So my name is Alvin Chin, and I'm the chair of the Vehicle Technology Society Chicago chapter. This is our website, ieeechicago.org/VT, if you want to know our previous events as well as our upcoming events. And you can also register from there. So basically, my day job, besides working as a chair here, is working for BMW Technology Corporation. So not the dealership. So don't ask me if you can get discounts for BMW cars. But I can help you in terms of technology. So I work in a technology corporation doing machine learning. So that's my day job. So for our IEEE Vehicle Technology Society Chicago chapter, we also have two other officers as well, and I'd like them to kind of stand up to, so our vice chair, Kevin Sudenberg in the back. Yep, so Kevin, he is from Argonne National Laboratory. So actually our previous meeting, which was last month in April, was held at Argonne. So we try to hold different events in different places, different types of topics. And then we also have an IEEE Young Professionals VTS student chair. So Zero? There you go, yeah. So Zero's from IIT, so thank you, Zero, for recruiting students coming in. Very nice. So basically our mission is like to create a community of academics and professionals that are interested in all things about the technology and engineering in the vehicle, right? So it's not just the actual engineering, the engine parts, but also in terms of like the software, the connected vehicles and autonomous vehicles. And we also do a lot of other activities, partnering with other societies too as well, like the Society of Automotive Engineers, which is also related to what we do as well. We try to have at least 3 meetings a year, if we can. We first started this in the BMW Technology office last year. So before the VTS Society was actually dormant for a couple years or so, and I kind of started to revive it because I wanted to kind of start doing some more stuff and getting more people to be more involved with vehicle technology. So I kind of revived this chapter, and hopefully we can continue onward and improve ourselves and get really good speakers like we have for tonight. And then for the topics that we deal with is vehicle ad hoc networks, 5G, because 5G is the enabler for the autonomous driving. We're also looking at vehicle networks, the cloud, connected vehicle platform, smart cities, charging, and et cetera. Yeah, question.
When you say vehicle, does that include airplanes and drones, or is it cars?
It's primarily cars, but we'll also consider as well other modes of transportation too as well. Yeah, definitely. So yeah, definitely if you know of like any companies or speakers that would like to help to sponsor or to host a meeting or so, yeah, let me know. We can do something like that too. So it shouldn't be only specifically car related, although most of the stuff is car related, but obviously yes, other modes of transportation are welcome too. So here are just some of our previous meetings that we had. So last year we had one with power transfer, wireless power transfer. I gave a talk last year at BMW about the ultimate smart driving machine, powering the connected car with machine learning. We had Joe Renz from New Mobility Lab talk about digital mobility. And then we had a joint with SAE Chicago about autonomous vehicles and mobility as a service. And then this year we had a joint meeting with IEEE Chicago, EMC, and SAE on the live wire electric motorcycle, which was presented by Harley Davidson, just a competitor to BMW's Motorrad. So I had to say that anyway. And then last month we had one mobility and continued importance of efficiency with Kevin Studenberg from Argonne. So you see we're pretty active, and if you have, like I said, if you have any suggestions for future meetings, please come and talk to me afterwards. All right, so you can connect with us on social networking. So we have a Facebook page, IEEE VTS Chicago. We have a LinkedIn page, and of course we have a Twitter page, IEEE VTS Chicago. So it should be very simple to find. And I'd like to, really give a big thanks to our co-sponsors who helped this meeting along with IEEE VTS. So I'd like the different officers of the different societies to stand up so we can give them their appreciation. So first of all, we are partnering with IEEE Computer Society. So they're IEEE Computer Society. Yeah. Thank you for your support. Also, we have IEEE APS and MTC. Is there anybody from that society here? Oh, anyway, thank you for them. Also, we have SAE Chicago. So I know I've seen SAE Chicago officers. Thank you, guys. Thank you. We also have ACM Chicago. So ACM is another organization that's kind of similar to IEEE, but different in a way. So anyway, and then last but not least, oops, not again. Yeah. All right, let's do this. All right, and then last but not least, of course, Stanford Historical Society, who was, yeah.
That's us.
Yeah, please stand up. And we have to thank them for the wonderful food and drinks, so thank you. So if there's any complaint about the food and drink, still talk to them. Okay, so now this comes to why you're here tonight, right? So Paul Wesling, so he is our speaker tonight. A little bit about him. He has an extended biography. I'm not going to go through that. You can read that by yourselves. But basically, he's an IEEE Life Fellow and Distinguished Lecturer. He's been in Valley for decades as an engineer, executive, resident, and educator. He's presented this talk worldwide. So you can actually see some of his talks that he's done. For example, he did one for Stanford Historical Society that's also on the YouTube, right? Yeah, so Stanford YouTube channel, yeah, thank you. He was Vice President of Publications for IEEE Electronics Packaging Society for 22 years. Supervised 4 archival journals and a newsletter. Received the IEEE Centennial Medal, the Board's Distinguished Service Award, Society Contribution Award, and the IEEE's 3rd Millennium Medal. If you want to contact him, that's his contact information. So he's going to be talking about, basically why we're all here today, right? Why we're all here, because, if it wasn't for Silicon Valley, right, we wouldn't be having our laptops, our computers, our, connected cars, our phones. So we really need to owe it to Silicon Valley. But really, what were the particular factors involved that really made Silicon Valley become the actual innovation hub for all the stuff we have here today? So Paul's going to explain about the various different factors, the things that kind of made it gel for Silicon Valley, and why only Silicon Valley could do it and not other places around the world. So please give a warm welcome to Paul Wesling.
Thank you. All right, see if I can find my slides here. Let's see. I'll bring it up. I know it's on the desktop. Oh, here we go. Let's see. Slideshow, start. I can read. Okay, did you want to start this other thing going?
It's already started.
Oh, okay. I'm going to get it off of the screen then. Maybe. More will do it. You know how to minimize it? Okay, so while he works on the computer stuff, I should also mention he didn't say one of the important things that BMW is providing tonight.
That will be a surprise.
Oh, there's a surprise coming. Some of you may have heard about this. Everybody gets this is an Oprah type.
Right.
So, just a show of hands, how many are here that are IEEE members? How many kind of heard about it through IEEE? So, it's probably 15 or so. ACM, how many from ACM heard it from there? About the same figures. Association for Computing Machinery, which I'm a member also. Good. From SAE, I saw a bunch of hands over. There's more back there. Great, thank you for joining us. The Stanford group, how many are related to Stanford? Again, about 25 or so. That's nice. Thanks, Sherry and Jill. So we're going to find out a little bit tonight about how Silicon Valley came about. I'm going to go back much further than you're used to, and we're going to also get a feeling for what's different about that. So this is a story you're probably familiar with. Here we go. This is the search. There's supposed to be a little black box around here with a pointer on. Here it is. So this is a story you're familiar with from the 80s, late 70s. But we had the Homebrew Computer Club meeting up in Menlo Park at SLAC at Stanford, behind Stanford. A bunch of hobbyists getting together. The hobbyist idea is kind of something that shows up a lot in this talk. Meeting up there, and Steve Wozniak, who was out of high school by this time, he was going to Berkeley and working part-time at HP. They came out with a 6502 microprocessor. You could get them for 20 bucks. They got two of them. You can afford two, which replaced a multi-$100 Motorola microprocessor, which you could not afford. But the nice thing was it used the same chips, the peripheral chips, as the other one. So he wrote an operating system for it, built the board, called it the Apple computer. His friends, he wanted to give it away to his friends. Here's how to build it. Yeah, I'll give you a hand with it. Here's the diagram. Steve Jobs says, wait, I think maybe there's some business here. And so the two of them got together, shown on the right. They were introduced by a friend of theirs, by Bill Fernandez, who lived just right near Steve Jobs, but Wozniak was only a couple of blocks away. And Wozniak's dad was the engineer, and so people used to kind of hang around and find out about what engineering was like and electrical engineering. So Fernandez thought, I should get these two guys together. So he brought Wozniak over in front of Jobs' house and introduced them, and that's how it happened. I like to say that the density of nerds in Silicon Valley is very high. There's a lot per square mile. And so there's probably one pretty near you who would probably partner with you in a startup. So it's kind of one of the things about the Silicon Valley is that it tends to be a place where a lot of stuff is going on and people are interfacing. Anyway, Woz and Jobs formed a partnership called Apple Computer Company. Started in a garage, which is how it's supposed to happen. And it now has one of the largest stock market capitalizations in the world. It's probably the most valuable brand in the world. So we're going to find out how this happened, why it happened, and why was it in this backwater called Northern California, which was not much at the time. In fact, Northern California before 1900 was known as the Valley of Heart's Delight. And so it was mainly blossoms in the springtime, miles and miles before they put in the freeways. When I drove up there back in the early 60s, it was just miles of blossoms through what was known as Cupertino. Well, and our product then was primarily prunes and cherries and apricots and things like that. So in the summer, you'd smell the apricots out there. They'd been sulfured and they were drying. So we could ship them back to all you Midwest and East Coast people during the winter and sell them for a high price. They had just invented the refrigerated boxcar. It was great. And we had a railroad by then. So Leland Stanford in the late 1880s said, someday you will see Palo Alto blooming with nearly all the flowers of the earth and the fruit and shade trees of every zone. In the future, we shall can this fruit and send it all over the globe in exchange for wealth, which they did for quite a few years. We have a lot of canneries that have ceased to exist now, but technology then overtook agriculture. And so now we have tilt-ups and stuff like that. So we started out as an agricultural area. We're going to go back to the start of a company called Federal Telegraph. It was formed in 1909 in Palo Alto. Cyril Elwell, who was a Stanford grad. Lee DeForest had invented the Audion vacuum tube. You electrical engineers, Lee DeForest is one of our heroes. He invented the vacuum tube and discovered how you could amplify things. And in fact, he came and worked for Federal Telegraph for a couple of years. I'll mention that a little later also. But he invented, while he was out in Palo Alto, the oscillator circuit, very critical, and the amplifier. Nobody knew how to make an amplifier. They had rectifiers, but that was about it. So he was working at Federal Telegraph from 1911 to 1913, and he pioneered what we know of as continuous wave radio, as opposed to spark transmitters that are really nasty. So this is an Audion. Maybe you want to turn up the back lights or something, but anyway, I'm going to pass this around. This is from that era. From Lee DeForest. The chief engineer at Federal Telegraph, boxed a couple of these up, gave them to his grandson, who said, Paul, I think you're talking about my grandfather there. I've got a box of stuff. I have no idea what it is. So I'm going to pass this Audion around. You can see what it is, and there's Lee DeForest. So I'll pass it down this side. If you can move it across and pass it up the other side, hopefully we'll get it done before my talk is over. That looks pretty good. Is that okay? I think it's pretty bright up here. Okay. Anyway, Federal Telegraph, Cyril Elwell went to Denmark to meet with Paulson, who had invented an arc transmitter, a much more quiet one than the old spark transmitter. And he had demonstrated that he could send Morse code, CW we call it. How many here are hand operators? Okay, I got 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, my wife is there. Oh, that's her. Okay. All right. Anyway, but also they could send voice. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And he decided he would try to form a little company with this arc transmitter. This is about a 30-watt arc transmitter that he brought back from Denmark. And he wanted to raise funds, what we would call angel investors. Sure enough, he went back to Stanford, and David Starr Jordan, who was the president of Stanford, kicked in $500, which is like $20,000 today. And Charles Marks, the professor in civil engineering, and John Casper Branner in geology kicked in $500 each. So here he is pulling money from friends and relatives, kind of what we think of as angel investing, to get this thing off the ground. And he was able to demonstrate communication all the way from San Francisco to Honolulu. And this is a San Francisco Star cartoon commemorating that first jump to Honolulu. So here's the first venture capital, and again we see Stanford's involvement here. The graduate who went away, stayed nearby, and the university kicking in to help the faculty and staff and everybody staying involved with these graduated students. Stanford in those days was a very practical university for California boys and girls to become productive citizens, long before the Stanford of today. So Federal Telegraph by the 1920s, it's changed a little. They had 3 high-power stations, one up in Portland, one in San Francisco, and one in Los Angeles. And with 500,000-watt transmitters, they could cover much of the Pacific Ocean. Very important. San Francisco is a maritime port. And so the shipping companies wanted to stay in contact to let the home office know what they're doing or get instructions about where to go next or whatever. And so they would charge 17 cents a word or 25 cents a word, something like that, to send messages out to the operators on the ships and back again. And there's a plaque in Palo Alto at the corner of Channing and Emerson here commemorating this this founding of Federal Telegraph based upon the pulse and arc transmitter. Well, another interesting thing, Doc Herhold was an engineering student at Stanford, Charles Herhold, and he set up his company in San Francisco. And it was destroyed in the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, and he thought, I think I want to find a safer place. So he moved to San Jose, back behind what's the Fairmont Hotel, and started a school for radio arts, teaching students or interested people about how radio works. And so we would have them make a little crystal receiver or something like that. And then in the evenings, Wednesday evenings, he would have a station, he called it FN, and they would broadcast to San Jose, called San Jose Calling. And he would talk and whatever, maybe read a poem. And then his wife was basically our first DJ, and she would go down to the record store and she'd bring records in and spin those so that they could listen to music and whatever for half an hour or an hour. It was great for the record store. They got free publicity and then they could sell the records. That later became what we know as station KCBS, which was one of our big AM and now an FM station. So there's some early involvement of another Stanford guy. And the third one was Otis Moorhead. He graduated in engineering, and he was a radio amateur, and they liked to build vacuum tubes. They were still pretty easy to build in those days because they weren't very good. And he established Moorhead Laboratories up in San Francisco in 1917 and manufactured knockoffs of tubes made by GE on the East Coast. Well, you can make 50 or 100 of those and get away with it, but when you start making 1,000 or so, somebody might notice, and GE noticed, and they filed a patent infringement lawsuit and shut him down. So intellectual property is going to be another big part of this talk. So anyway, he got put out of business in the early 1920s for violating patents that were held by General Electric. Some of the defining events in those days, well, there was a lot of private wealth in California from the earlier time of the gold rush, and they were still pulling gold out of the hills, hydraulic mining and stuff like that. So there was a lot of money floating around San Francisco and coming into the Bay Area there. The Titanic sinking in 1912 was the big thing. The radio operator tried to get a hold of a radio operator on the Carpathian, and he'd already gone to bed. So that a lot of people didn't get rescued because of that, and they thought, this radio stuff is really important. Also, World War I drove that home because once they had these pulse and transmitters and other transmitters and receivers on ships, they found they could coordinate their war efforts a lot better. So the U.S. Navy started down to push for better ship-to-shore and other communication modes because they saw this as a critical technology for defense. There was also the economics. They had undersea cables, but when something goes out on an undersea cable, or it's so long that you can't really hear it at the other end, remember there weren't any amplifiers yet, or something broke, it was kind of hard to fix down there under the ocean. So it was kind of neat, this idea of maybe being able to send a radio wave out across the country with no wires and be able to get it on the other side. So this could get rid of a lot of costs in cables and telegraph lines, things like that. And that brought a lot of activity, a lot of development, a lot of funding to the San Francisco Bay Area. We're going to follow three of those early pioneers, William Eitel, Jack McCullough, and Charlie Litton. This is Charlie Litton over here. He's 11 years old in Palo Alto, and it says wireless house. He's got his own little radio station at the age of 11. You know, us ham radio operators, we kind of know about this stuff. I'll talk a little bit more about ham radio a little bit later on. But these were Bay Area families with a lot of entrepreneurship. I'll talk a little bit about that. And they were born and raised in the Bay Area. So they had kind of absorbed the culture of the Bay Area, which was kind of experimental and hobbyish. Bill Eitel took shop classes at Los Gatos High School, and he worked in his father's quarry up in the Santa Cruz Mountains during term time. He'd go up there and help out with stuff. And then in the summer, he worked at the Hall Scott Motor Car Company in Oakland, which is his uncle ran. They built the Liberty engine in World War I for the airplanes. Anyway, he learned to operate complex machinery, develop fixtures, things like that. So he was a hands-on ham kind of guy. Jack McCullough and Charlie Litton went to high school in San Francisco at the California School of Mechanical Arts. It was started by James Lick, who did the Lick Observatory above San Jose. Now it's Lick Wilmerding High School. Anyway, it was opened in 1895 by James Lick to give a free education to technically oriented boys and girls in Northern California. And it was one of the best technical high schools in California. They had a lot of training in mechanical trades and in drawing and making and fabricating. And Litton said he got a realistic feel of materials and processes during those high school years at the California School of Mechanical Arts. Well, McCullough continued on at the local junior college. Litton enrolled in Stanford's mechanical engineering department. In those days, there was no electrical engineering department. You graduated in mechanical engineering or chemical engineering with your four-year degree. Then you went one more year to get your electrical engineering specialty. I think there were 5 specialties: power, propulsion, generation, I don't know. Electrical was no electronics yet. This is all electrical. And so, again, a very practical flavor in the courses taught at Stanford. He got his BS in mechanical engineering in 24, and that was when Terman taught the first class in communications engineering, and he took it and he was hooked. So he's taken this communication engineering fundamentals class, and Litton thought that was neat stuff. So our 3 young men were introduced to ham radio through their families and friends in the 1910s and 1920s. The Bay Area ham radio was very interesting. It was an isolated maritime port, but not too many people. So shipping companies, as I mentioned, needed radio operators. So Doc Harehold was training them. And when they started licensing in about 1920 or 21, there were 1,200 licensed amateurs in the Bay Area, which is 10% of the US population of hams. So you know there's a bubble there, but I don't think they realized at the time, but there's a bubble there that's telling you something's going to happen. All right, it's got too many representatives. So ham radio was a very active center of radio production in the 1910s and 20s. We had Remler making radio sets. If you spell that backwards, it's spelled Elmer. You hams recognize that. Magnavox was started by Peter Jensen, you know, Jensen speakers and Magnavox speakers. He's the guy who Paulson sent over for a couple of years to help Cyril Elwell learn how to make these arc transmitters. And like a lot of people who go to Silicon Valley, he decided to stay. So he started his company up in Napa Valley and then moved it to Oakland. Heinz and Kaufman were building custom radio equipment. Federal Telegraph, I mentioned, they were producing radio transmitters. And by 1920, they had million-watt transmitters. That's a lot of power. The nice thing for kids or people who like technology is there were a lot of parts available for local hobbyists because the companies are making stuff and there's scrap and there's friends that work there and stuff like that. And there were also a lot of jobs for radio amateurs, which was kind of neat. So it was a very productive area to be involved in. Well, the camaraderie is kind of a part of that ham radio subculture, working together and so on. And now if you're a ham radio operator, you're probably a geek like me, and you really can't talk to anybody. But if you've got something to show somebody or explain, then you can get really animated about this. So it's nice if you're a technologist that you've got something to talk about besides yourself. So, but they communicated over the air, but also face to face with ham radio conventions and things like that. Very sociable groups. It's very egalitarian and democratic. Little distinction of class. When Eitel was president of the Santa Clara County Radio Club in the mid-20s, he said we had farm boys and Stanford students, Federal Telegraph technicians, retired executives, all kinds of people working together in this hobby space. Kind of interesting. Hobbies, that's another interesting sub part of this talk. So in ham radio technology in those days, one of the reasons was to extend the technology. That's why you got involved, to make things better, a better circuit, maybe a better transmitter, or to be able to talk to somebody further away than anybody else had done before. And it was very competitive But then when you got done, you explained to everybody how to do it. You helped them do it too. So it's collaborative. This competition and collaboration together is a hallmark of Silicon Valley as we know it today. A lot like this homebrew computer club with Steve and Steve. One Steve trying to give the stuff away. You know, just, you're a bunch of hobbyists. I want everybody to try this. And that's like a lot like today's Silicon Valley. Well, another pioneer was young Fred Terman. His dad moved from the Midwest. That was Lewis Terman. Some of you old people remember probably taking the Stanford-Binet IQ test back in the 50s and 60s. That was Lewis Terman's work. He was, so he moved to San Bernardino, where I grew up, as principal of the high school long before I got there. But then he was hired by Los Angeles Normal School, which we know of today as UCLA. And then Cubberley hired him away, and he came up to Stanford, where he was in the education department. Anyway, he got a house up there on Mayfield. And Herbert Hoover, who had graduated in the very first Stanford class and was kind of our first techie, was a mining engineer. And he made his fortune over in China and the Far East and whatever. And he came back to campus about 1915 and moved in across the street from the Termans. And Herbert Hoover Jr., his son, was about 14 or so. Roland Marx, the son of Charles Marx. George Branner, the son of the geology professor. And Jack Franklin, whose father was the head of the chemistry department. Herbert Hoover Jr. said, all three of us were neighbors, and upon pushing the key of one of our imposing contraptions would holler out the window to see if it had been received on the other side of the street. So here's a bunch of 12 to 15-year-old kids playing with this new technology. And here's Herbert Hoover Jr. in 1923 with his ham station. And young Fred Terman said, if you saw a 90-foot pole sticking up somewhere in somebody's backyard, you'd go and knock on the door and get acquainted with him, because obviously he's playing with radio, and you'd like to see what he can do and maybe get a few parts from him and learn from him what he's doing. And while he was in high school, Federal Telegraph was only a half a mile down El Camino. So he would go down there and hang out and talk to the people and get spare parts. And then he worked there one summer also while he was a college student. And this is Fred Terman at 17 with his ham radio. And it says Harvard there, but he went to Stanford. Well, his dad was on the faculty. He got free admission. I think probably tuition in those days was probably like $60 or something. So we're following these entrepreneurs, Bill Eitel, Charlie Litton, and Jack McCullough. They were ham friends, and they experimented with this new contraption called vacuum tubes in about 1920 or so. And in those days, you built your own parts. I remember getting an old oatmeal box and winding a coil on it as a pickup conductor for my radio. But you typically build a lot of your own stuff. And they made notable contributions. Again, they're pushing this radio technology. In 1924, Charlie Litton and the Radio Club made the first across the Pacific contact to Australia and New Zealand, reaching way out, discovering they can bounce these waves off the upper atmosphere. And in 1928, Eitel pioneered the 30 megahertz band, what we call 10 meters, for talking all the way across the country. Remember, the government thought these were useless bands. They gave the amateurs these bands, and they kept the low bands, which are the useless ones. Yeah, government, you know. So the tube business I've mentioned a little earlier, talking about Moorhead, General Electric, Westinghouse, and AT&T on the East Coast were building tubes, and they developed high-power transmitting tubes in the early 1920s. Technology kept advancing, but they were difficult to produce, and it was hard to make reliable ones. So you'd make one, and you'd plug it in, and after maybe 30 or 40 days, the gain would go down, would get gas in there, would turn brown, things like that. And it required precise machining and glass blowing. They used Pyrex glass from Corning. And particularly the sealing techniques to keep that vacuum in there, very difficult. Well, our entrepreneurs, Litton got a job through a ham friend at Federal Telegraph. And it got built up during the 1920s to about 60 engineers, and they became sole suppliers of radio to international telephone and telegraph. So they were setting up radio stations in Spain and the Canal Zone and Puerto Rico, the Philippines, things like that for long-range communication. Bill Eitel got a job through a local ham friend at Heitz and Kaufman, and Heitz himself was a ham. and they focused on making great, what they call HF, high frequency radio equipment. And he recruited Jack McCullough the next year to join him because they knew each other as kids at high school. This is the Perham House in Palo Alto. Federal Telegraph was in this building and that building, and Lee DeForest and his 2 technicians were in this building for a couple of years. It's on Emerson in Palo Alto. Not there anymore, but there's a plaque. So the tube business in the 20s, you could not buy transmitting tubes. Remember, after World War I, the Navy thought, hey, we got to keep this technology for ourselves. And if anybody's going to sell this stuff overseas, they can't have our tubes because they might copy them in France or Japan or someplace. So they wouldn't sell tubes to our companies. They wanted to ensure US dominance. And so they formed a new company called Radio Corporation of America, the Navy and GE, with the US government's blessing, set up this company and then brought in Westinghouse and Western Electric, which was AT&T, and they pooled their patents in radio technology and tube development, and they cross-licensed them only to fully US companies. They wouldn't sell these power tubes to our Bay Area companies because it was a threat to US control. So both companies needed to develop new tubes that didn't violate the patents. And ITEL headed up one tube shop and Litton headed up the other. So here they are in competition. You think so? Well, they had to design especially around about 250 key RCA patents that they held, which would keep you from making almost any kind of tube in those days, which was very difficult. So they hired locally. A lot of them had radio background, and they collaborated together. Here's 2 companies working together. Now, you wouldn't see Raytheon working with IBM or GE working with Ford. That's not. But remember, these are little companies, and to survive, they have to work together, kind of like Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. They're a partnership working with other people and so on. And it was based on their friendship over the years in radio and other stuff. And of course, they work closely with patent attorneys, first of all, to make sure they don't violate patents. When the patent says that the plate surrounds the grid, they says, well, what if we only did 170 degrees on this side and 170 on that side? New patent. Okay, so you don't violate patents and you try to find ways to work around them and invent something new. So they had to develop a new rugged power tube. Here's the 354, one of the ones they developed. They used new materials because the old ones were patented. New manufacturing methods. Charlie Litton was a great, you'll hear later also, was a great guy on technique and process control and continuous improvement. They made the plates out of a different material to avoid the patents, made better shock resistant seals for higher reliability and higher vacuums. Charlie Litton developed the oil vacuum pump. And so they kept developing ways to make things better. They had tubes that had a lot longer life and were more reliable than the ones made by RCA and their licensees. But the key was it didn't infringe RCA's patents, so they couldn't be shut down. Okay, so Litton invented, so these were made by hands, and you couldn't make a lot of them at a time. It was a difficult thing to make. So you make this tube, you put the things in, and this one would be different from this one, so you have to keep testing to see which one you want to use here, which might go over there and stuff. Well, Charlie Litton wanted to make them in volume and repeatable. So he made a glass lathe. How many of you used a lathe to turn wood or something? Yeah, I had one when I was a kid. So he made a lathe, and you could put your glass tube blank from Pyrex on here, and you could build a whole tube on an axis of symmetry and get it very repeatable. And you could seal it while it was still on here. So you had that solid tube there. And he built it in a small building on the back of his parents' property. So we sort of call that a garage. So it sort of qualifies as a Silicon Valley startup. Well, now it's the 1930s. We're into the Depression, and things are really tight. So Heinz and Kaufman gets bought out, goes to the East Coast, and Bill Eitel and Jack McCullough decide they're not going to the East Coast, kind of like Peter Jensen earlier. They decided to build high power, high frequency tubes almost exclusively for the hands. All right, so they felt there was a good market there. So they got financing. A guy named Harrison was a real estate agent. He put in $20,000. And Preddy had a string of movie theaters. He's put in $20,000. In return for that $40,000, they got half of the ITEL McCullough company, what we know as IMAC. And ITEL and McCullough brought their know-how, and they got the other 50%. So this is kind of a typical, what you might see in a startup today, where you've got venture capitals getting, companies getting 20% or 30% or something like that. And the principals getting the rest of the ownership, and they shared the profits. This is, again, something new, profit sharing, and this is a precursor to the Menlo Park venture capital firms that are out on Sand Hill Road that we hear about. Here's an ad out of QST magazine for the iMac 150T. This is being sold now to hams because you could take this tube, you could accidentally put too much power on it for 7 seconds and take it off and say, is it still alive? And it was. It was very rugged tube, so it was survivable in really nasty situations, like with people who don't know what they're doing, like hams. Well, during the Depression, there was a lot of cooperation, again, between the companies. Litton helped set up IMAC's vacuum tube shop, and he gave them castings of his glass lathe, and also the blueprints, and said, I don't want to make them, you guys make your own. So they had this free exchange of technical and even commercial information, because again, they're small companies, and it's the Depression, and it's really hard to keep going. So it reduced the risks of these two small tube-related businesses, kind of like Jobs and Wozniak and the whole Brew Computer Club, helping each other. Well, in 1936, Fred Terman asked Litton, Charlie Litton, to join the Stanford faculty, basically as a lecturer, and help out in the labs, help the students understand what's going on with this technology. How do I do this? If that's going to be my project, what's the best way to approach this? He was an advisor there to the staff and students. And they sold some intellectual property to Sperry back on Long Island, and Litton got a $1,000 award for this, which is like $30,000 today. Anyway, he says, I don't need that, give it to Fred Terman. So Fred Terman had a student who graduated and had a job at General Electric. Remember, this is the Depression, so if you've got a job, that's pretty neat, and you don't want to leave a job. So Terman writes to this Dave Packard kid, who was one of his students, graduated in 36, I think, and said, hey, I got $1,000. For $500, you and Lucille can live for a year, and you can work on your master's degree, and you got $500 for lab equipment. And Dave thought for a few nanoseconds and decided to pop into the car, and they drove west, and he worked on his master's degree, met Bill Hewlett. Bill had invented this idea of a stable oscillator, and they formed Hewlett-Packard in this garage, which you can drive by and see, which is, again, as I mentioned for several other cases, this university graduate engineer cooperation. Well, the late 30s, there's a growing threat to peace. Japan and Germany are tooling up, maybe for war. President Roosevelt starts putting money into rebuilding the Army and Navy. And in the United Kingdom, in England, they developed something called radio detection and ranging, or radar. The idea was you could take a radio signal and send it out with a big antenna, and then you'd listen, and it would come back, and you'd say, oh, there's something out there at 135 degrees, and it's about 40 miles, and it's sort of the size of a barn or a skyscraper. I can't really discern, but you could find out a little bit about it with this radar. But it was fairly low frequency radar, and it wasn't real effective. What they needed was higher voltage, so they could put out a better pulse, and much higher frequency, so they could figure out what the medium size and small stuff was out there. And they needed transmitting tubes that could do that. The Navy found the only ones that really worked well for that were the iMac tubes that they built for the hams, because they worked at those higher frequencies and powers, and that was what they needed. So they started developing, doing additional development on radar. A couple of kids, Russell and Sigurd Varian, grew up in Palo Alto, but at least they were around Palo Alto for a while, but then they went down near San Luis Obispo, and they were basically a commune. But they started worrying about Germany, and they thought, hey, maybe we could use microwaves, real small waves like we use for our cell phones, things like actually even above that. And they could detect planes and stuff coming in. So in 1937, Russ Varian moved to Stanford's labs to work with Bill Hansen, who was the physics professor, kind of the brain of the operation. And they worked back and forth, and Russell would come in with ideas and say, we could try this, and would this work? And Hanson would say, well, that won't work. Do this. And so he'd come back in a couple of months and try something else. They came up with, oh, it did make its way around. They came up with the Claystron, this is about a 30 kilowatt Claystron here, which I call an integrated circuit because it's antennas and tune cavities and stuff. Anyway, it was really neat at handling these microwave frequencies. And they used Litton's free advice on how to build it. Here's Charlie Litton again, because he's at Stanford. And Hanson's theoretical assistance out of the physics department. And probably only in Palo Alto. This is 1939, and so there's a Hitler headline here. Our president is building up the armed forces, and Hitler is saying, just give me one more country. Give me Czechoslovakia and I'll be happy, or whatever. But the real important headline I circled, new Stanford radio invention heralds revolutionary changes near Sigurd and Russell Varian and the announcement of the Claystron, which became a variable frequency for receivers of radar and all kinds of stuff during World War II. Well, wartime expansion. Well, San Francisco and the Bay Area was a microwave hotbed because we had ITEL, McCulloch, IMAC, and all this microwave stuff going on with the Claystrons. Most of the technology was moved by the US government back to the East Coast. So we saw Lincoln Labs at MIT and the Radio Research Lab at Harvard, which Truman went to. But when the war was over, they came back to Stanford and brought a lot of people with them. And so our companies out there developed a rather progressive approach to business. They were used to working across boundaries, cooperatively. And so it was very egalitarian within a company. If you had a problem, you go talk to the guy over there. You wouldn't tell your boss's boss to go talk to their boss to talk to his boss to have him answer a question. You didn't do that sort of thing. And also between companies, people still worked with what you might think of as competitors, but certainly as supporters in other companies. So the managerial techniques they used thwarted unions. They really couldn't get started out there. And they had profit sharing. We mentioned that a little earlier. Actually, we talked about sharing ownership, but they started profit sharing, tuition reimbursement. Henry Kaiser was building shipyards. Thank you. Okay. Henry Kaiser was building shipyards, and so he had people working there 10, 12 hours a day, welders. We had Rosie the Riveter out there building these ships. And so they put in cafeterias, and they put in medical clinics, which became the Kaiser Permanente health system. That's why it's called Kaiser. And we had the HP way. HP was formed, as we mentioned, rather early. But by the 1950s, they decided that they didn't want to have more than about 50,000 people in a division. So as soon as they got real big, they'd split it. And they'd send those people up to Roseville and those up to Colorado and things like that. And so we have a lot of innovations going on. Has everybody seen the Allianz? Get back in one piece. I appreciate that. And HP had their own philosophy, which came out of Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard and so on. And that's, you can look that up and you can publish it. But when I was at Tandem Computers, for example, the first 4 or 5 days you were in charm school. You went, the president would come and talk for 45 minutes, and a bunch of other people would tell you what's unique about Tandem and how we do things. And we learned a bunch of rules. I remember one of them was that if anybody in a meeting came up with a new idea, you couldn't say anything bad about it for 5 minutes. You can't say, well, marketing would never sell something like that, or we couldn't integrate that. Or you can't do that at Tandem. You got to say, well, you can try this, and because first of all, it might be a good idea. You talk about it for a while, and you may discover it's really something important, or at least some aspect of it. But the other one is, if you keep shooting people down, if the manager says, oh, can't do that, Jim, Jim's not going to come up with any new ideas that he's going to bring up in a meeting. So you really throttle ideas and entrepreneurship, and that's a real problem. So we had that 5-minute rule. Similar things that Hewlett Packard kind of seeded this philosophy, which went to Fairchild, Intel, Tandem, and the other companies there. So After the war, there was a lot of realignment. The tubes that they had built during the war now were surplus, so they were worth 3 cents on the dollar. And so you couldn't sell the existing stuff. But IMAC went on to develop a new line of better tubes that worked at even higher frequencies. The FCC pulled a surprise. FM radio, we know FM radio these days, was supposed to be at around 40 to 50 megahertz. Well, they put a surprise. They put it up at 100 megahertz, which is where we see it now, 88 to 108 on your dial. Well, RCA's tubes wouldn't work at those high frequencies. So they did the next best thing. They copied the IMAC tube, all right, which did work. Well, you know what the next slide says. IMAC sued RCA and General Electric for patent infringement and won the lawsuit. And GE and RCA and Westinghouse and so on had to stop making those tubes. Well, now they can't make tubes that go up to the FM band. Well, GE was tired of making tubes anyway, so they were happy then to have IMAC make the tubes and RCA be basically the sales and distribution network. So now we're driving this technology out into the industry, and with the tubes labeled RCA, but they're built under license or built by IMAC. So now the big dog in tubes is Silicon Valley. So we've done the better tubes, and the other companies have stopped making them for those applications, which didn't bother GE that much because they decided they wanted to get into broadcasting. So they formed NBC, which is GE, to start radio and then TV broadcasting. So they got into that business and they didn't want to make the parts anymore. Well, after the war, Charlie Litton focused on these claistrons. He thought this is a really neat device. And so he scaled it up to 30 megawatts, and they built the linear accelerator. Here's 280 freeway coming across. So this is the linear accelerator out behind Stanford, which was a major physics development, kind of like CERN. And it transformed Stanford into a major player now in physics research. And if anybody's had cancer treatment, you know somebody who's in cancer treatment, that machine, that radiation machine, has a claistron in it from, that came out of Litton, or one of the successors to Litton. So that's claistron technology, develop those x-rays. And so Litton developed a recipe for how to build a firm. He says, get a little initial capital, not too much, not like Uber or Lyft or anything, but just get some money. I think they get too much. Get an R&D contract or some new idea, pull together an engineering or a software team, start up a product line, go into production, and then iterate and get better and find out what the customers need and build yourself a company. And that's kind of how Silicon Valley companies came about. You've heard a lot about how they'll focus on something and then they will discover that doesn't work, and they have a term for that called pivoting, where they think, oh, how we're doing this. So you've seen that happen with startups where they'll pivot to some new technology when they get something blocked. Okay, well, one of the examples, the Varian brothers started up Varian Associates, not Varian Corporation. They wanted to have about a dozen of them kind of working together. It was going to be an association without much structure, and their wives were involved. They got some property in Menlo Park, and they had chicken coops out back, so they couldn't sell product, they could sell eggs or produce. I mean, it was again, as I said, they grew up in a commune, so it's kind of this communal aspect. Well, they started making microwave equipment, and they made some measuring instruments, made a half a dozen or whatever, but they didn't want to make more of them, so they said to Dave Packard, hey, for $20,000, which is probably a lot of money in those days even, we'll show you how to build this thing and give you the plans and whatever, and you can make that kind of equipment in addition to what you're making now. So that they decided, yes, they will do that, and they started up the Santa Rosa and Santa Clara divisions, which became Agilent, which is now Keysight. So here again, they're taking ideas and passing them back and forth and forming new big companies on it. This was their first product, the audio oscillator. Well, this is a mural that's in Palo Alto at Courthouse Square. It was painted in 2001 or 2002, and it kind of pulls together this, what I've been talking about. So with Stanford in the background, here's Cyril Elwell and Leonard Fuller, whose tube this was, talking to Ernest Lawrence. And this is the pole piece for this big magnetically operated arc transmitter. And Leonard Fuller talked to Ernest Lawrence and said, hey, you got this cute little 5-inch cyclotron. What would you do with a 42-inch? And Lawrence says, whoa, okay. So they had an extra one that they were planning to install in China, but after the war, after World War I, nobody wanted it, so it sat out and it rusted in Palo Alto. So they pulled the magnet out and wound it and gave it to Ernest Lawrence. And that turned into about 6 Nobel Prizes by 1960 in high energy physics research at UC Berkeley. Leonard Fuller became the head of the engineering department at UC Berkeley. Here we've got Doc Hairhold, and he's broadcasting, and this is his wife over here listening. And here's Lee DeForest with his Audion tube that he invented and learned how to make an oscillator and an amplifier. Charlie Litton with a small glass lathe here, making tubes. Here's Fred Terman with Bill Packard and or Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard and their audio oscillator. Philo Farnsworth, who invented electronics television up the peninsula around San Mateo or something. Here's his television tube. Here are the Heinz and Kaufman people. So it kind of thematically pulls together what I've been talking about, these early days where this technology got started and the entrepreneurship started. And this is a mural in Palo Alto. It's an office. You can see cubicles down here, and it's on the wall. I think they're going to move it back to the campus in the next couple of years. But right now, it's just in an office building, and you can walk in and take a look. It's at Birch and Sheridan, which is basically El Camino and Page Mill. Well, into the 1950s, we get the invention of the transistor at Bell Labs by Bill Shockley and his workers. Shockley was raised in Palo Alto. Here he is with his dog in Palo Alto. He went to Caltech and then to MIT and went to Bell Labs. And they developed this transistor idea, the idea that you didn't have to heat up something and spend all this energy, and maybe you could amplify with something that's solid state. Very nifty. Well, Bill Shockley didn't think he got enough recognition at Bell Labs, so he left and went back to Caltech and taught there. And Arnold Beckman said, hey, you want to build a silicon transistor company? I'll fund you, and you can locate it in Culver City, which is eastern LA. And Bill Shockley says, LA? I don't think so, because his mother had graduated from Stanford and lived in Palo Alto, so he came up to Palo Alto, and he started his company, I like to say, 100 yards outside of Palo Alto in Mountain View, where the old Sears building was. And he was a tough guy to work for. If you've ever read about Bill Shockley, probably read a lot about him. But he kept changing priorities, and he made people take lie detector tests, kind of like Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, I think. But anyway, these guys couldn't work for him. So they wrote up a thing saying, we'd like to find some company to hire us 8 guys. They were known as the Traitorous 8. Bob Noyce and Charlie and Gordon Moore and those guys. And in 1957, they left to form Fairchild, which was the first real venture capital funding. And back in the 50s and 60s, if you took solid state electronics, you probably used Shockley's book. And at Fairchild, they invented the planar process, Jean Harnais, a way to, instead of making individual transistors, you could make transistors all over the top of this thing and have them isolated from each other with a sealed top and sealed sides. Really nifty. And that became the technology of preference for all of the future technology in transistors and integrated circuits. Well, it required a lot of important infrastructure. You had to have high vacuum technology. We got that. Charlie Litton had a lot of basic patents in that area. Precise furnaces, we can do that. Glass blowing and quartz machining. We've got machinists that can machine quartz. Ultra pure gases and water. We've got that. We know how to keep things really clean. And process control and continuous improvement. These were things that we had mastered in the early days through tubes and other stuff, microwave tubes and iMac and so on. So all these capabilities that had been developed in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, it made sense to put the integrated circuits and the transistors in Silicon Valley. So we have Fairchild and Signetics and all these other, what we call the Fair children, forming from that. And so, that's the wrong button. The planar process was really important. Here's an IEEE milestone plaque here, and this is a California plaque saying the first commercially practicable integrated circuit. Was sort of co-invented by Bob Noyce and by Jack Kilby down at TI. They both got Nobel Prizes for that. But the practical one was here in California. And Isaac Asimov, the famous sci-fi writer, said that the planar process is the most important moment since man emerged as a life form. And that may have been exaggerating a little bit, but you know, you've got about 1 billion transistors in your cell phone. I mean, 1 billion? Who needs 1 billion of them? And all the things that they can do as they get smaller and cheaper. It's amazing what we've done over the last 30, 40 years with Moore's Law and the development of this technology, pushing it along. So now we have the formation of the Fairchildren. Gordon Moore and Bob Noyce finally left Fairchild and formed Intel, Integrated Electronics. It got abbreviated Intel, to focus mainly initially on memory ICs. And the first real venture capital, they got a hold of Arthur Rock back in New York, and he tried to find investors, was not successful. Finally, he did find some investors, and they put up the money for this. And Ted Hoff, employee number 12, was assigned a project. They were taking all kinds of business. So Japan wanted to develop a 5-chip calculator. So Ted Hoff took that on, and it became 10 chips and 14 and 17, and he finally said, why don't we just make a little engine and have a piece of memory, and we'll call it a microprocessor. So here we have now the 4004 microprocessor developed by Ted Hoff at Intel, which became Intel's bread and butter, and still basically is. So at the end, in the 1960s, we've had a big change. The peninsula and the Santa Clara Valley were major electronic centers. A lot of stuff that happened in weapon systems and space systems happened there. Wide range of industrial goods. We get the radar range, which didn't actually appeal to people. They didn't want to have a radar system in their kitchen, so they called it a microwave oven. Radar range was not a good trade name, although Amana did patent it or trademark it. So now Silicon Valley is the central hub of the U.S. defense effort and also the U.S. manufacturing economy. We're seeing this electronics go into people's homes, into cars. We got Motorola making radios for cars out of Schaumburg, Illinois. Why did this all happen out there? Why did this become such an important place? Well, a lot of it's the business climate. In the East, you have large vertically integrated firms. So IBM builds disk drives and computers and software and everything, and DEC builds their own disk drives and their VAX operating system. And they have the PDP family and software, and it's all soup to nuts in one company. That's kind of the focus on the East Coast, is vertical integration. And because you've got that, you've got this huge legacy to haul along to the next technology. You can update your computer, but oh gosh, we've got to do the disk drives too. And how about the operating system? Well, basically it became very slow to adjust to market changes. Whereas Silicon Valley, as I've described, was very decentralized. Lots of little companies starting up and failing and growing big and buying up other little companies. So we have a lot of specialized, very nimble engineering-driven companies and this network of small and medium-sized companies that support them. So I'm not going to do this. There's a company in Newark that can do that, or there's a company up here that can help me with that, or I can use Salesforce for all my customer relations and things like that. So again, we had this sharing, this collaboration, as I describe it. And so they also drew from a common workforce. California in 1873 passed a law. They will not enforce non-compete clauses in employment contracts. So you may sign a contract that says, if I leave your company, I won't compete with you or go to a competitor for 2 years. So what are you going to do? Well, California, they can't enforce those. You can leave Google, start a new company right away, and they can sue you. But they can't win because it's against the law in California. There's only 3 states, California, North Carolina, and Oklahoma, to do that. If you work in Massachusetts or Illinois, if you sign one of those contracts, you've got to go do some coding or do some consulting for a year or whatever before you can compete. Now, you can't take the customer lists and secrets and things like that, but you can go work somewhere else. This is a major thing too, and you hear about that. It's kind of nice because when I worked different companies in California, if you didn't like the company you were working for 10 or 20,000 more, you can go across the street and work there. We have all these companies, and they're all looking for technologists. And if you've already got some experience somewhere, they want to hire you. Pass the word, and you can get another job. You can't do that in some places. I remember Utica, New York, where Univac was. They had one great big Remington gun factory, which is where they made the Univac computers. And if you worked there and quit, you had to move out of the whole community because that was the really only employer. So it was really kind of nice. It let us adapt more rapidly to change, and this is a real place to thrive for entrepreneurs and engineers and the so on that supported them. So the practical skills and competencies over the last 100 years, this community of hobbyists like the ham radio operators or all the meetup groups we have now, all this collaboration and sharing, I describe the analog time up to about 1970. But then in digital, and then we developed software and biotech, mobile, big data, deep learning, virtual reality, and augmented reality, now autonomous vehicles and blockchain. All of this technology is coming out, well, a lot of different places, but a lot of it comes out of Silicon Valley. So there's a large number of cutting edge entrepreneurs, just came out of a startup or another company, now start their own company with a couple of friends. We've got local universities for research and development, Santa Clara, San Jose, Berkeley, Stanford, and a lot of support industries to support them, and also role models. It's kind of expected that you're part of this culture of innovation when you grow up in school. Like I mentioned, Bill Fernandez inviting Steve to join the other Steve. And so in the 40s and 50s, we had Shockley and his transistor company. So a question for you, how many of you have Apple iPhones? About 2/3, okay? So your little intelligent agent is called Siri, right? So why do they call it Siri? Because SRI is too hard to pronounce. So, well, Stanford Research Institute, SRI, the couple of guys there developed this technology, this voice recognition and analysis technology, left and started their own company, and Apple bought them. And they just never renamed it from Siri. They always kind of called it Siri for SRI. So there's a piece of trivia for you. I mentioned Fairchild Semiconductor. We had Hewlett-Packard. We had, I'm not even going into the aerospace side. There's a huge thing there with Lockheed and L'Oreal and so on. In the 60s, we had more semiconductor companies. We had AMD, National Semiconductor. I mentioned Intel, Intersil. We had disk drives, leaving IBM, which was founded in San Jose as far as disk drives go. Now we've got a company that actually focuses on making equipment that you use to make semiconductors. They're making lithography equipment because there's enough companies to buy it, but you have this infrastructure developing here. Frog Design that developed the initial Macintosh computer and stuff. This is Steve Jobs' idea of design. Very important, the design aspects of something. In the 70s, now we have computer companies. I worked at Tandem. Apple has founded Four-Phase Systems. Right, Donna? And then we have software, okay? So we've got Oracle making big software. We've got computer companies. I worked for Amdahl for 7 years. Video games, we've got Atari. There's enough market now and enough technology that can make video games. We've got Genentech, started up by Cohen at Stanford and Herb Boyer up at UC San Francisco. They invented recombinant DNA, and that became Genentech, which was the whole biotechnology business. And Stanford and UC San Francisco shared about $300 million over the last 40 years in royalties on that original patent. Now in the 80s, we have software. We've got enough Macintoshes that Adobe comes out with an editing program for graphics and puts it on the PC also. Intuit, your software for your tax every April 15th. We've got Cisco, which sprang out of that Sandy Lerner and her husband, Leonard, came out of Stanford, forming basically routers for the internet. We've got the PC now is growing into workstations. So we've got Silicon Graphics and Sun, which stands for Stanford University Network, Sun, and MIPS making these high-speed graphics processors for making movies for Hollywood, for example, things like that. We've got IBM Research Labs at Almaden, Next Computer. My favorite, Fry's Electronics, right? This is a grocery store. It's a chain of grocery stores that John Fry had, and they decided to put in some electronics. And they discovered all these people buying electronics, so eventually they ended up with 2 rows of groceries, and all the rest was electronics. And they put those in on Dallas or something, in Chicago. Yeah, okay. So that was a fun place to go to and build your own computers. In the 90s, we have now Tesla starting up. We've got software companies like Google, a couple of kids from Stanford that wanted to make a better search engine with an algorithm. Facebook starts up. Juniper in networking. We've got applications, cloud-based applications like Salesforce and Netflix streaming movies and stuff like that, Pandora. NVIDIA making the neural network stuff that's in the back of your Tesla, all right, that does the artificial intelligence stuff. And we have companies moving there. This, Detroit, Chicago, this is automotive country, right? SAE members. Well, all the companies do a lot of their development there. Ford just hired a couple hundred engineers in a development group right in the Stanford Industrial Park. GM bought Cruise Automation. They want to hire another 1,000 engineers there. Toyota is investing $1 billion, most of it around Stanford and some around MIT, over 10 years to develop their technology. We have Mercedes, BMW, and so on, US Patent Office. Samsung, so here's a Korean company, and they make washing machines and cell phones, all kinds of stuff, and they have operating systems. It's quite a conglomerate. So they want to buy a startup. And, well, would you like to move to Korea? I don't think so. So what they did was they built a 10-story building in Sunnyvale. And they say, okay, we're buying your intellectual property, and you're going to be on the 2nd floor in the south wing. And this company's going to be on the 9th floor east wing. And they're putting them all together as kind of an incubator of technology and developer of technology for Samsung in Korea. Interesting. And there's this little grocery company from Arkansas? Holy cow. But they've been in the Bay Area for about 15 or 20 years, and that's where they develop all the inventory control, all that kind of stuff for Walmart. So I saw this graph on new technologies, blockchain. I thought, holy cow, San Francisco and New York are neck and neck. That looks like we're losing technology. I thought, uh-oh. So I looked down here, and here's Palo Alto, Menlo Park, Sunnyvale, Mountain View, San Jose. So I thought, this has to be regraphed. So here's, well, I mean, statistics lie, right? So I pulled the whole Bay Area together, which, and compared to New York, and New York, that's good work. I mean, we can't do it all there. There isn't enough housing for all of us, but it shows that the number of jobs available, or the people looking for jobs, the Bay Area is the place to go. So where is Silicon Valley? We used to think it's the Santa Clara Valley, but no, that's not really true. It's really, they call it a metaphysical idea, this Silicon Valley. And if you look at a map, it's right down here near Sunnyvale and Palo Alto, but really it goes all the way up through San Francisco. You hear about Uber, right? Silicon Valley company? They're in San Francisco. We should tell them they can't be a Silicon Valley company. But anyway, it goes over to East Bay and down to Santa Cruz and Scotts Valley and up to Oakland, probably over to Livermore, maybe eventually Sacramento will be Silicon Valley. So it's kind of a concept now, whereas it used to really be true that things were in the valley. What about venture capital funding? Well, the black stuff was from 2014, and in those days, that year, 55% of the venture capital invested was in the Bay Area, and about 10% in New England, and about 9% in New York, and 3% in Austin, and some in Southern California. But most of it, the bulk of it, was out here in Silicon Valley. Well, I updated this recently for 2017 numbers. It went from 55% down to 43%. So there's more going into New England, and New York went from 9% to 16%. So we're seeing more development there because there's not enough capacity really in so-called Silicon Valley. But again, the bulk of it is right here, the largest chunk. And where is innovation today? I mentioned meetups. I get announcements about 2 a week of new meetup groups that start, and they start having meetings, and then they're disbanded, or maybe they get really big with 600 or 800 people in them. We have a number of startups, incubators. There's the 500 startups that starts up a bunch of companies every quarter. Y Combinator is a real well-known startup. IndieBio handles startups in the biosphere, so to speak. We have open source computing. This is kind of, again, a shared idea of volunteers working together on open source. And we're seeing that go into more corporate companies working together to develop this open source software. It's very egalitarian. And again, it's like the ham radio and the homebrew computer club I described earlier. It's people working together kind of as a hobby, working on new ideas. So how different are we? I happen to like Thomas Friedman in the New York Times, and he said, in Silicon Valley, great collaborators are prized. In Washington, D.C., they are hanged. Like, if you're a Democrat, you don't want to talk to a Republican, you get hanged. But when they say collaborator, they mean traitor. Here in Silicon Valley, they mean colleagues. So we don't speak the same language. But collaboration is a real important part of Silicon Valley, and on the East Coast, you don't collaborate. That's our attitude, they say in Silicon Valley. For example, we say failure is a feature, not a bug. I mean, if something fails, you figure out what it is and move on. One of the companies, won't name them, their initial motto was move fast and break things. You know who that is. And then Jeremy Warner had this, which isn't really true, but it sort of rings true. America innovates, China duplicates, and Europe regulates. It kind of feels that way. And Yoda said, do or do not. There is no try. So we have these people working 16, 18 hours a day, focused with their buddies, working on stuff, that full commitment idea of starting up something of your own. So the defining characteristics, competition and cooperation, very important. We don't see that so much in other parts of the world. I lectured in Istanbul. I wanted to start a little mini Silicon Valley north of Istanbul, and I was there to kind of teach them what was different. And over there, instead of bottom up, they think top down. So Ankara decides what happens and tells you what to do. I don't think it works that way. We're more often hobby focused. Startups happen that way. We have small dynamic startups. You don't tend to read about the startups, you read about the big companies. So you read about big companies in Silicon Valley laying off, Lockheed or HP or whatever. But the other 8,000 little companies, you don't read about them. They haven't hit the press yet. So we have a lot of these little startups. And we have a lot more flexibility. We're able to, as I say, pivot to some new idea if this one isn't working out, or if somebody else comes into that space. If Facebook decides to do that, you've got to go over here and do something different. Okay. It's very egalitarian, as I described. You don't have designated parking spaces. If the president doesn't get there till 8:30, he parks out in the lower 40. You don't have your own offices. Typically, it's a bullpen at Intel. Andy Grove had his office as an open space. When I was a vice president, I had an open space office. We have an open door policy. So at Tandem Computers, for example, if there was a problem that was a corporate problem, I could go into Jimmy Trybig's office, he was the president, put my feet up on his desk and say, Jimmy, we got a problem. So very across, I used to tell people that going to work is like going to play in a sandbox. You never know what's going to happen, and you get these interesting projects, you get to work with people across the whole organization. We had Friday beer bus, a high employee focus. So out by the swimming pool, I think we were the first company to have a swimming pool in the valley. And I like volleyball, so we put in a volleyball court, sand volleyball court. So you had to be good to your employees because they could go work somewhere else. Okay. So we have a large pool of entrepreneurs and technologists, and there are other cultural and management factors that go into this, but these are the kinds of things that differentiate startups, Silicon Valley companies from others. So there's a book on this. You can there's a sheet I've passed out, so you can download this set of slides and get the reading list. But there's a good book called Making Silicon Valley by Christophe Lecuyer, who covers a lot of this stuff. For Fred Terman at Stanford, Stu Gilmore wrote this book, very good coverage, fairly thick book on Fred Terman and his development and working with Wally Sterling, the president, and developing what's now the Stanford Industrial Park and these pinnacles of excellence. Another fun book, especially for the hams, is called The Tube Guys. Here's a nice big tube, and they developed some pretty neat ones over the years. And Norm Pond was president of Varian. The HP Phenomena by Chuck House. Again, how the company grew from about 1954, he starts, I think. And he covers it up through Mark Hurd through 2009. And how they keep divisionalizing and pushing out responsibility, pushing down decisions. The book by Leslie Berlin on Bob Noyce, the man behind the microchip. Again, another Midwestern guy who came west. Actually, he went to Philadelphia. He was at Philco in Philadelphia, and he got a call. And the guy says, "This is Bill Shockley calling." And Noyce says it was like getting a call from God. So and so he came and joined him. Another good book, Decoding Silicon Valley, about how things really work here. About Steve Jobs, the Walter Isaacson book. How many of you have read Walter Isaacson's book? It's a very good one. I enjoyed that. About Google. Again, Google is more typical Silicon Valley, where you're supposed to spend 5 or 10 or maybe 20% of your time working on your own project. I had that at Amwell. I had 10% of my time given to me to be often working on IEEE volunteer stuff, for example. And so at Google, you can spend time working on your own project with other people in addition to your Google work. You may end up leaving. Well, that's they on me, but then they may buy you back in 2 years if this works out. So it's a very open environment, kind of this California idea of spreading it around. How many of you have Netflix streaming? I think this may be on Amazon Prime too. I know it's available on the internet. This was a documentary for South by Southwest called Something Ventured. Very fun because you get to hear the actual guys, Arthur Rock and Tom Perkins, talking about how venture capital came about and how they decide on companies. And, there's about a dozen VC guys there. And Gordon Moore and Sandy Lerner, Jimmy Trybig, they're all interviewed here and they talk about what it's like. It's a fun video to watch. So we've reviewed the good old days, probably before you thought Silicon Valley started, because it wasn't named that until 1971. And a lot of people think maybe it started with Fairchild or Bill Shockley or something like that, but it really goes back to the very early 20th century. And as I say, you can download the slides off the internet. This lecture is also on Stanford's YouTube channel I mentioned earlier. So if you go to your smart TV and go to the YouTube app and search for Stanford Silicon Valley, it'll be in the first couple. There's 7,000 or 8,000 books on it. And so you can watch it again or stick it on your friends, tell them they gotta watch it. So you're welcome to email me if you've got other great stories. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap it up and go open to questions. Thank you. Before we start the questions, we ought to have Alan talk about the surprise. You want to do that, or do you want to?
We can do the question.
Okay. So questions or stories that you've got about technology. Yes, sir.
What was the first use of the term Silicon Valley?
It was 1971, and I forget the guy, but he would wrote a newsletter. He would write a newsletter about what was going on in technology for Washington. And I found this, it doesn't come to my mind. He's the one that coined the term Silicon Valley. Didn't come about till then. Before then, it really should have been called Vacuum Valley. And it was suggested to me later on. I've got a good friend who says it really should have been called Storage Valley for IBM and the disk drives and so on. And then later on, a bunch of guys thought, it's not Silicon Valley, we don't make ICs there anymore. We should call it Photonics Valley. But Silicon Valley seems to be. Yes, sir.
You know, one thing that was kind of in your talk that I don't know if you want to emphasize is this concept of networks.
So networking is very important. I did mention the number of nodes per square mile.
Well, I don't mean that, but I mean like the networks on the board of Sun, their big claim to fame was distributed computing. I was part of that.
Yes.
So
Coaxial network. So this was a big technology. It was started between UCLA and Stanford. First connection was there. And Ben Cerf, who was ACM president. And also involved in IEEE. He and I exchanged stuff back and forth. But he developed the TCP/IP protocol, which would allow disparate computers to talk to each other through a piece of hardware called a router. And the very first one was between UCLA and SRI. And that developed then into a broader consortium of universities that were connected. It was called the ARPANET back in those days. And then that, eventually, I got on the ARPANET from Canada because I was working in IEEE stuff. I couldn't do commercial stuff. And that later became a commercial thing. Well, they developed this networking on the Stanford campus. Were you involved in that at all?
No, I was involved a few years later.
Okay.
I helped popularize it.
Okay. Well, anyway, the original network then got spun off as Sun Micro, as Cisco. Really, the Cisco, by Leonard and Sandy Lerner. And that became the first commercial router. And that whole networking idea of being able to hook my computer, which is a PC, to yours, which is a Mac, or to a VAX machine, or to an IBM machine, that intercommunication and those standard protocols, the stack of how do you do that, became standards that allowed networking of computers. Very important area. But also networking of people. Other questions?
So you talked about the culture of Silicon Valley, about like moving back to breaking things, but now, I did also your talk was on electronics, but now there's the medical device industry, the biotech industry, which you can't really move back to breaking things. There's patients involved. So how do you see?
Unless you're Elizabeth Holmes.
Yes, exactly. But how do you see those like more regulated these things?
So Silicon Valley has developed lots of tools like the computer that allows you to look at genomes and analyze them or whatever. So we provide the tools, but it's true that in regulated industries, which may be finance, fintech, a lot of that in New York, not highly regulated yet. Certainly biotech is highly regulated. So you've got organizations to go through, you've got to prove things are effective. Is your Apple Watch really good enough to detect a heart attack? Well, you got to prove it first before you're allowed to sell it as that. So in some areas that are more regulated, it's coming more slowly. But again, we see the technology percolating in. Back when I went to school, computers was a special area, computer science or computer engineering. But not anymore. Medical school, legal profession, all the various departments now have to use computers as a tool. So they learn software, they learn applications and so on. So we see this being applied across. And in some areas it's slower because you've got more to prove and a bigger hurdle to get over. Does that answer the question? So, but again, we see it permeating. One of the slowest is in government. You think you could replace an awful lot of government with websites. And you can, but it's a big job, and it's a very slow-going one because you've got 20 million people that some of them may be out of work at some point. So you've got to be careful about that. So there's a number of things you've got that you have either legal or medical constraints. Questions? Yes.
What are your thoughts on the role of design?
Of like industrial design? Or just design area? So design is quite interesting. So first, hardware. We see that, and I mentioned frog design, or things like the Macintosh or the MacBook and things like that. We see a lot more human computer interface, HCI work now. That's HCM area, big area. Also in software, we have the user interface, and we worry about, are they going to know which button to push in this software and so on. And so we have design going into these, informing the engineers. Us engineers love to just make something and then say, is there a market for this? Sell them over here. And then they discover it doesn't work there. It's the wrong size, or it's too small, or something wrong. So by bringing in industrial design and user interface design, UX people, you can optimize it before you release it. So hopefully you've done some studies of what's needed and how to make things work better for people. So when they buy it or when a company implements that software, Questions?
Maybe one more question.
Okay.
You know what, actually, I'm sorry, this isn't actually a contact question, it's an announcement.
Okay.
For people, we have a lot of bags of pizza
Oh.
next door, and before you leave, I would really like for you to ask yourself the question, can I use a bag of pizza?
We can have it for tomorrow lunch.
That might be really good tomorrow.
So make an exit through these side doors and go through this.
So grab a bag of pizza, that's right, so I'm sorry, there is still time for one question.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay,
One more question?
one more?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
You showed a picture of the Apple One there.
I did.
76 or about the board. There were two other hobby computers about at the same time.
The Altair.
The Altair.
Commodore.
Well, it's what we covered there. It was the processing technology. And I had one of those. I built a 76 out of the box. Is it worth anything?
Yes, it probably is.
So
So
the instruction.
one of the first kits came out of Arizona, I think, was the Altair. And so these kits of computers were available. You could buy them and put them together. I don't think they had an operating system. It was kind of
It had a 2K operating system. It's a single board.
pretty basic. But the idea that Steve Wozniak had, first of all, he used a cheap 6502 microprocessor. Second, he didn't want to buy a chip to handle this was a cassette tape drive from memory. So he designed it in software. Here's the software. So it really drove the cost down on this thing. And so it was not the first computer, but it was a very successful until IBM got in here.
Yeah, so I think okay, maybe just one last one.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was going to also add lean agile is really take over the world
Yes.
now.
So the whole idea of waterfall production of software and also hardware. It used to be you'd start a project and about 3 years later you would get it done. You'd make your alpha and beta things, and then you'd try it out at a couple of customers and you'd start selling it. Well, that doesn't work too well anymore because 3 years is an eternity. So the idea of lean manufacturing and being able to do not just in time, but multiple releases, what's that called? Okay, and so the idea of software is you put something out there, and you keep doing new releases, maybe a couple a day or a few a week or something like that.
Minimum viable product.
Mhm. And you might be able to segment your market like Facebook does and say, oh, we'd like to maybe change this. Try to do it for these 14 million people over here. See if they click more on the ads, and they'll do something else over here. And if it doesn't work, so they can put out multiple things and create a code library, which will be the current one plus all kinds of other ones. And maybe once a week they'll bring in more stuff. And if it didn't work, they'll back it out and press it open source. And open source is the same way. You have GitHub, and you have ways of developing this using other people's code to form your code. It's available in your license. That whole area of lean manufacturing and just-in-time releasing is a very important area.
So we can keep going on if you want to. Otherwise, we'll be staying here till like morning tomorrow. So we're going to end on this note, and so as a token of appreciation, we'd like to thank.
Well, thank you.
Okay, and for those people who are wanting to get their professional development hours, like for their PhD, for their professional engineers, we have also certificates. Dan and also Zero also has. So reach out your hand, and then we will give it to you.
This helped inform your education.
Yeah. And last but not least, which I'm sure probably a lot of people will know about this, but in the spirit of, technology, and Silicon Valley.
Outside the name.
Okay.
Double
Outside
click.
here. There you go.
Yeah, click there.
There you go, yeah. So showing this type of, Silicon Valley, stuff and technology and, AI and things like that, I'm pleased to say that we have a BMW i8 convertible, which is in the parking lot. Yeah.
We can see some of this new technology.
Oops.
Show us again.
So let me do the slides. Let me do it in. Here we go. There we go. In front of Chicago.
What's the price tag of that?
Oh.
You have to ask, we can't afford it.
it tonight. So if you want to have a look at it, we could go afterwards. And we can get a group photo in front of the car.
All right.
But you can't drive it though, unfortunately. Unless you come and work for BMW.
But you have to take some pizza in order to stand in the front.
Okay, so thank you everyone for coming. And I will see you at our next event. All right, thanks. It's already available now.
It is.
Yeah, you can buy it now.
The BMW what?
i8, the i8 Roadster is called.
Why is it called an I?
Oh, I because it's electric.
Electric.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, that's what it is. Okay.
Like, you know how you have iPhone,
Well,
whatever,
that's
so
what I
yeah,
said, what-
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
Where is it in the one right by the side of the building?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's right by this lot 10, this parking lot, yeah.
You know, if you guys take care of the parking tickets.